particular hello, to you in your various parts of the diocese. It's great to be able to spend this morning with you, sinking into the gospel, which we will spend this year coming, exploring, and I pray living together as God's people here in this part of England, in Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire. And is anyone here in Barnet? Got anyone in Barnet? Some of us will be in Barnet, even if nobody here is. So as we live in these various places, I pray that we will live this gospel and live the prayer which Kate has just prayed for us and with us. I've got some slides which I have prepared for today. I've been asked if these can be made available, and the answer to that is yes, that's absolutely fine. So what I'll do is I will email, it's a PowerPoint presentation. I'm very happy to email that to Kate. And then if you would like it, do, I guess, get in touch with her, and that will be absolutely fine. There aren't any other lecture notes to go with this. It's just the PowerPoint as it is. But as I say, you're very welcome to it if that's helpful. Just so that you have an idea of what to expect this morning. When we planned this a little while ago, we decided on a couple of particular areas to focus on. The first is power, and then the second is Luke as a storyteller, and then the third is art and Luke. The first, power and Luke, is quite challenging in all sorts of ways. And so, as Kate said, prepare to have your coffee ready and engage your brain. And then I've deliberately put the more relaxing, potentially more enjoyable stuff towards the end of the morning, actually around lunchtime, where we can look at some art together and listen to some poetry together. My prayer is that you will find things in this which will inspire you, spark ideas, and stay with you through this liturgical year. So before, let's start sharing my screen. Actually, I've called, in fact, I think today is called Preaching with Luke, but I do hope that this will inspire you to do more than preach, to think about what you might do by way of small groups, Bible study teaching, teaching with children in schools, and young people in groups, and maybe all sorts of other ideas that will spark off this. So, introductions. Firstly, what are you hoping to get out of today? You're probably quite a busy person, I would imagine. You've probably got all sorts of things that you could be doing on a Tuesday morning. You might well have taken time out of what you would normally be doing to be here. You might have put your normal commitments aside. You've prioritized this learning. Why have you done that? What has led you to sign up for this particular seminar or workshop? What are you hoping to get out of today? And so I just want to ask you to pause for a moment and to think about how you would answer that question. And what I would suggest, if you're happy to do this, is you might like to write an answer to that in the chat box. You might not, and you might not be able to actually if you're on a tablet or something like that. But if you would like to, feel free just to write something in the chat. What am I hoping to get out of this session today? It can be as simple or as complex, as impressive, or as everyday as you know it to be true to be. Okay. Inspiration, more tools from the toolbox to draw on. That's a very Benedictine idea, the toolbox. Sermon fodder and refreshments, deeper understanding, new perspective, fresh insights, new angle, a refocus, refresh. We want to learn more. This is all great stuff. New insights, increase understanding. Yeah, thank you, Atali. Into passages we think we know well. A fresh approach to familiar stories, ideas and energy for next year. Luke is the gospel I know the least. Okay, to be fed. Okay, good. To learn more about Luke to use. fresh perspective and an opportunity to be alongside Luke. Thank you, Andrea. That's all great stuff. Okay, so we're here to learn. We're here to gain insights. We're here to gain inspiration. We're here to be refreshed in our understanding of the gospel, to soak in the stories, ready for more informed and enthusiastic sermons. Thank you, Sarah. Just actually as a follow-on question to this, and just because I'm interested, again, if you can't do this, or if you're not, if it's not your thing, don't feel obliged. But if you would like to, just write in the chat box, for how many years have you been preaching? I'm quite interested to know. I'm aware that maybe some of us are quite new to preaching, very new, maybe 4, 10, 2 ordained, 20, 30, 8, 20, 10, 25, 3, seriously, 22, 12, 2. Yeah, there's a range, isn't there? I hope you're keeping an eye on these two, 17, 12, 16. Yeah, occasional over years, 7, 30 plus. I think that's possibly the longest so far. So we've got a real mixture of people in this room. Some of us are really new to preaching, and some of us have been preaching for years and years and years. What's new to one person might be something that others have known for years. Okay, so I hope that all of us will gain something new, however new to preaching we are, and however long we have been soaking ourselves in the gospel. So, oh dear, look at that typo. Gospel, the word, as I'm sure you know, means good news. So one question that I'd like you to keep front and center in your minds and in your hearts through today is this: how might what we learn today be good news for your church and your community? I've become increasingly convicted that our preaching must be good news. And whatever else we do in our preaching, we must preach the good news. Okay, a lot of people over the last couple of years have struggled in life. As I'm sure you know, the pandemic has brought complexity and trauma and loss and constant readjustments to an insecure and unreliable world. And people's sense of their belonging within their own communities has been challenged as they haven't been able to gather in person. And people's sense maybe of being connected to God has been challenged as they haven't been able to be in church in the same way as they would used to be. So we need to be proclaiming good news. We do always, I believe very much as Christians, but particularly at this time. How do we preach good news? And how do we root what we believe to be good news in intellectual integrity with what we know to be true in the Bible? Okay, so as Kate said, you will need a Bible for today. I'd really encourage you to have one to hand. If you haven't got one to hand, take a moment now to go and grab one. And I would encourage you to get something to write with and something to write on, whether that's pen and paper or whether that's having something like a Word document open elsewhere on your computer, because it'd be great for you to make some notes. So as we've said, this first session will go from now until 10:30. And this session is going to focus on Luke and power. Okay, so Kate, could we have our first breakout room, please? Because before we turn to the gospel itself, I want us just to think for a moment about this notion of power and what we construe when we hear the word power, what we associate with that word. Okay, so here are some questions for you to ponder just for a moment together. We're going to have small groups, just groups of 3. You may know the people with whom you are talking, you may not, so you might want to take a moment to introduce yourselves to one another and to think together about this word power. What comes into your mind? Who comes into your mind? Do you think of particular people? Do you think of particular events? Do you think of particular forces? Okay, so what comes into your mind and who comes into your mind? Do these feel like positive associations, or do they feel like negative associations? Do they feel emboldening, or do they feel oppressive? Okay, and then think about your church and your local community. If you were to talk to your church about power, what do you think they would make of it? What do you think your church feels about its own power, okay, or its own powers in the world? Okay, this is a big question, and it will determine some of how your church responds to what we find in Luke's gospel when we hear, as you do quite a lot, what Jesus has to say about power and what Luke has to say about power. So this is our first breakout room, and if we could just have, I think, Kate, if we could just have just over 5 minutes, if that's okay. Thank you. So you should get invited to go off into a breakout room. We won't have any feedback afterwards. This is just to get you thinking together about this idea.
Right, this should be working for everyone. Here we go.
Kate, I'm not going to join a group because
yeah, that's fine.
I find that when I do, people all kind of, if I'm leading something, it kind of inhibits people. So I've actually moved somebody into my place. I've moved our curate into my place.
That's fine.
She's brilliant. She's absolutely brilliant.
I've got one person who's not joined.
Yeah.
Jenny, are you all right? Are you there? Maybe you've gone to answer the phone or something. Fine, splendid.
Good.
Great, thank you.
Who do you think of when you think of power, Kate? Or what do you think of?
Let me just pause recording.
Based on what I'd encourage you to just take some notes on what you have shared with each other and to hold that question. How do you think your church feels when it comes to its own powers? And actually, that's the question. I said that we wouldn't have any feedback, but actually that question is worth lingering on for a moment because it's a very important one for us as preachers. So I wonder if anyone would like to share anything. There is no obligation, but do feel free if you would like to share any responses to that question. The easiest thing, since we are in a large group, is for you simply now to unmute yourself and to speak. And please do feel emboldened to do that if you would like to.
Hi, in our group, we started to talk very easily and swiftly into defining power as negative. And we just, in that sense that actually, because we have quite a negative connotation with power and the broken promises and trusts of our worldly leaders, then we're more easily wanting to seek independence and self-assertion. As opposed to being under the authority of things. That was one point out of a brilliant discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nicolette. I'm sure, I wonder if anybody else could identify with that. I think we live in a culture which is possibly rightly mistrustful of much power that we see in the world. Thank you. Any other thoughts on how our churches relate to the notion of power?
I think churches can feel quite powerless to their society and the people around them, and left behind by power.
Yeah, thank you, Julian. That's, I'm sure, a really common experience in congregations to feel powerless, and for churches to pick up the impression from various quarters that they are powerless to either control events or to have the resources to meet the challenges of moments. I wonder if anyone else kind of identifies with that expression.
Absolutely. Yes, and I suspect that the only way we can wield power is through service. Is to make ourselves available to us.
Yeah. Thank you.
as people and as plants, as buildings.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, and thank you for the comments in chat. Longing to see God obviously at work in power more. Yes, thank you, Wendy. And yes, power comes with responsibility. Yes, it does. Thank you. Do hold on to these thoughts. They are really important. So let's think then about what's going on in Luke's gospel with regard to power. A couple of words to get us thinking. The Greek word that is translated as power, when we see this in not only in Luke's gospel, but in most of the New Testament, as we'll come on to see, is the Greek word dunamis, which I've written it there in Greek and then transliterated it into Latin text, dunamis, from which of course we get the word dynamite, which is quite a lovely association, really, isn't it? The semantic range is pretty straightforward. It means ability, powers. So somebody who can run a marathon is somebody with dunamis, with the ability to pound the pavements mile after mile. There are a load of words in Greek that are not exactly synonyms, but associated and often used alongside the word power, especially in the letter to the Ephesians. Actually, that's one letter which kind of conflates these words and makes them really quite beautifully poetic statements about God's power. So energia is the first one, and that is the working, and that's the phrase that's used in Ephesians, the working of his power. Okay, there is something there about something that is active and happening in the moment. Okay, so it's a very dynamic word. Of course, the word dynamic comes from dunamis as well. Exousia is often translated, most normally translated as authority. And as we hear these words, we might well think of associated words in English. We might well think of executive, for example. That's the most obvious relation in English. Ischus is strength, and that is used most normally in Greek of physical strength. Okay, so Samson is somebody with great strength that comes, of course, from his hair. And kratos is normally translated power. We might think, for example, of the famous icon of Christ Pantocrator, which is a very Greek word, Christ who has power over pantos, over everything. Okay, so the word dunamis is core New Testament vocabulary. It's found just about everywhere in the New Testament. It's not unique to Luke by any means. It's used in all three synoptic gospels, and it's used widely throughout the epistles of Paul and others too. It's interesting noting which words are particular to Paul and which words are used more broadly. This is one of those words which is used very broadly. So, for example, it's used in the letter to the Hebrews and in 1st and 2nd Peter, as well as the letters attributed to Paul. It's used in Revelation. But one interesting thing is it doesn't appear once in the Gospel of John. Okay, that's interesting. And that could spin off a whole other study day on John's Gospel. It seems that John goes out of his way to avoid talking about the dunamis of Jesus in John's Gospel. It's all about works and signs. It's not about miracles or powers. So that's a very interesting thing to note. So as I say, this is very core New Testament vocabulary. It's core Lucan vocabulary, used 15 times in Luke and 10 times in Acts. As I've said, it's normally translated power. Sometimes it's used in the plural, such as in Matthew 7, verse 22, when the NRSV translates it as miracles. And that's quite interesting just to note. So if you, where is it? No, it's not right. The NRSV translates it deeds of power. Yep. Okay, so that's interesting, isn't it? So other translations use miracle. Okay, and one of the word pairings which comes up a lot is the word exousia in relation to power. So power and authority, one way round or the other. So we might look at Luke 4, which is a really important chapter. Every chapter is important, but there's a lot that goes on in Luke 4 that really sets the course for the gospel. And this is the conclusion after the healing of a man with an unclean spirit. they were all amazed and kept saying to one another, "What kind of utterance is this? For with authority and power, he commands the unclean spirits, and out they come." So this is the report that spreads about Jesus from place to place, that he is somebody of power and authority. And then when we think about the story that we find in Luke 7, after the healing of the centurion's servant, if you just want to flick to Luke 7, we find the centurion who has the servant who is lowered. That's not right. He says, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore, I did not presume to come to you, but only speak the word and let my servant be healed. For I also am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and the slave does it." So here is someone who understands the nature of authority. Here is someone who understands what it means to be under authority. And of course, the implication all the way through Luke's gospel is that Jesus is working with the authority of God. Okay, let's go back to Luke 1. And if you would like to flick back there, you will see that in Luke 1, verse 17, we have the words that are spoken about about John the Baptist to Zechariah. "With the spirit and power of Elijah, he will go before him to turn the hearts of parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." This is what is to come with John the Baptist. Okay, here, as you probably know, what's being quoted is the last verse of the minor prophets, the last words of the book of Malachi. "Lo, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of parents to their children and the hearts of children to their parents, so that I will not come and strike the land with a curse." So there's something there about the coming Elijah. So we're just going to focus for a moment on what's implied in this coming Elijah, because this is really important for understanding what expectations are in the hearts and minds of people on John the Baptist and then on Jesus. I'm just going to also draw your attention to one verse from the book of the book that's got three names, actually, Sirach or Ecclesiasticus or Ben Sirach, which you'll find in the Apocrypha. Okay, and this, if you have a Bible with an Apocrypha in it, you will find it, I think in the NRSV, it goes under the name of Ecclesiasticus. But there we have the same words being echoed. "At the appointed time, it is written, you are destined to calm the wrath of God before it breaks out in fury, to turn the hearts of parents to their children, and to restore the tribes of Jacob." Okay, so clearly in Sirach 48, we have an echo of Malachi 4, and we hear that same echo in Luke chapter 1. Now, one question here, if you look at the last phrase there of that quote from Sirach 48, do you recognize another Bible quote that is being alluded to? Don't worry if you don't, but I'm just wondering if anyone can see this. So this is a quote from Isaiah 49. So what we have in Isaiah 49, verses 4, 5 and 6, is a prophecy which will be talking about the destiny of Israel. Okay, so here we have Isaiah 49. And now the Lord says, he who formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the sight of the Lord, and my God has become my strength. He says, it is too light a thing that you should be my servants to raise up, restore the tribes of Jacob, and to restore the survivors of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. So these are the kind of hopes that are in the hearts of people as they await the Elijah who is to come. So how do these hopes grow over time? One of the bodies of literature that can give us insight into the messianic hopes in the intertestamental period are, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Elijah is portrayed as an eschatological priest, a priest who will be raised up at the last days. So we have a kind of messianic trifold hope of a Davidic king, a prophetic Moses figure, and a priestly Elijah. And sometimes in our liturgies, in our prayers, in our hymns, we will hear that Jesus is referred to as prophet, priest, and king. And those words are not arbitrary. Those words are really carefully chosen because they represent this ancient messianic hope that the Messiah will fulfill these offices and will perfectly inhabit these offices. Now, expectations and hopes about the Messiah were many and varied, but these three functions, these three offices were at the heart of it. One thing to say about Elijah is if you read the Elijah stories in Samuel Kings, what you will find is that Elijah is indeed a very powerful figure, but the word power is never actually used of him in the original context. What we do find, though, is that he does some things which normally only priests do. So, for example, in 1 Kings 19, he anoints kings. That's normally reserved for priests. He offers sacrifice in 1 Kings 18. And if you read carefully that very graphic and kind of extraordinarily beautiful story of the showdown between Elijah, his opposition team, if you like, are the priests of Baal. So he's being basically portrayed in opposition to false priests. So it's easy to see how over time a priestly nature became associated with Elijah, even though that's not the original role he takes in the biblical text. And so in the intertestamental periods, Isaiah, the servant songs in Deutero Isaiah, which we heard from in Isaiah 49, and in particular Isaiah 61, become associated with the Elijah figure who is to come. And those words from the end of Malachi become really important in terms of articulating the hopes for the coming Elijah. Okay, and so the words that are conflated are in particular Isaiah 61 and Malachi 4, 5-6. The idea that evolves is that the Elijah to come will fulfill Isaiah 61. And then if we have that in mind, when we look into Luke chapter 4, which of course is the moment when Jesus is in the temple and opens the scroll, and you might like to just flick to that and have a quick look at it. When he came to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendants, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed upon him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." So Jesus is saying something there about inhabiting the spirit of the Elijah who is to come. One of the other messianic hopes that we see, particularly in the Dead Sea Scrolls, is that the priest, the Elijah priest, will be the perfect interpreter of the law. Okay, and you see a line there from the Dead Sea Scrolls around that. One last thing about the power of Elijah. And again, it's good to just know this, and so that when we hear these words, we know something of the background to them. We find somebody in the Old Testament book of Numbers, Phineas. He comes up in Numbers 25. You might like to have a quick flick to Numbers to find Phineas. He becomes the archetypal zealot in the intertestamental period, because that's exactly the word that is used of him in Numbers 25. Where is it? Let me just quickly find it. The Lord spoke to Moses. This is Numbers 25:10. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by manifesting such zeal among them on my behalf, that in my jealousy I did not consume the Israelites. Therefore say, I hereby grant him my covenant of peace. It shall be for him and for his descendants after him a covenant of perpetual priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the Israelites. Okay, so here's a character who is not one who's terribly famous in the corpus of Old Testament narratives, but this enormously significant promise is given to him and his descendants, and that's not forgotten down the ages. So one of the rabbinic texts very clearly puts together this character of Phineas and the character of the Elijah to come. Okay, and so here we see, I won't read it all. He called the name of Phineas by the name of Elijah, okay, making them one and the same. Elijah of blessed memory, of those who repented in Gilead, for he brought about the repentance of Israel in the lands of Gilead. Okay, so there is something here about priesthood that is associated with Elijah in the intertestamental period, and that association is strengthened by the identification of Elijah with Phineas. Okay, so what is the power of Elijah? That's the basic question here, isn't it? The power of Elijah, I would say, is a priestly power that people are hoping for, longing for, praying for, looking out for, to fulfill that covenant of peace, to interpret the law, and to signal the coming of the end times. That's why these words that are spoken to Zechariah about John the Baptist are so significant. With the spirit and power of Elijah, he will go before him. Okay, so these are powerful, powerful words signifying that this person will fulfill the longings and the hopes of the people of God down the ages. One thing to bear in mind with all of this is that what we're talking about here is typology. And that's not simply cracking the code, working out, oh, well, in that case, Elijah means Phineas and John the Baptist means Elijah. And it's not as simple and straightforward as that. There's a kind of nimbleness to typology, whereby characters can be associated with other characters, sometimes in quite subtle ways, but so as to evoke an association and to give value and meaning to the new character. Okay, so at the start of Luke's Gospel, we have the promise of a baby. And at this point in Luke 1, we don't know anything about this baby at all, because this is a new character in the narrative of the people of God. The only way that we can make sense of the significance of this baby is to associate him with those who've gone before. And in this case, John the Baptist is associated with these very profound and powerfully held hopes and longings. So when we think about typology, don't just think about it in terms of so-and-so refers to so-and-so. It's more complex and it's more nuanced and subtle than that. What about Jesus then? If John the Baptist is going in the spirit and power of Elijah, where does that leave Jesus? Well, like I said, Luke 4 is really important. And that moment in the synagogue where Jesus reads the scroll of the prophet Isaiah and then says, today, this has been fulfilled in your hearing, is a powerful moment of arguably stepping into the role of the new and greater Elijah. Okay, and then if we flick on through Luke 4 and see what happens, he begins to get into trouble quite quickly. How very dare you, essentially say people. Is this not Joseph's son? Verse 22. We'll come back to the doctor cure yourself a little bit later. But then Jesus says, truly, I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. Who does he begin talking about straight away? Elijah. And he starts pointing out the human limitations of Elijah. There were many widows in Israel at the time of Elijah. Okay, he starts pointing to the things that Elijah didn't do. Okay, this is arguably to say Elijah was just a human, and here I am today. This scripture really has been fulfilled in your hearing. And the outcome, of course, is to provoke a huge rage in the people who hear him. Going on to 4:28, when they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. They wanted to kill him because of the rage that was provoked by him critiquing Elijah. Okay, so Jesus is being audacious here, taking a huge risk and claiming that the status he has claimed that day is greater than the status of Elijah. Arguably, we see something similar in Matthew's gospel with Moses. Jesus is the new and greater Moses. Okay. Before we move on to other aspects of power, I just wondered, are there any questions that anybody would like to ask on any of this? Or feel free to either write in chat or to unmute yourself. The question you might like to consider is this: if Jesus is living in the power of Elijah, and if that power is handed on to the church, which, as we'll see in a moment, it is, what does that mean for our congregations? What does it mean for us as Christians to live as God's people, living out a priestly power, fulfilling a covenant of peace, interpreting the law, and living in expectation of the end times? Those might be some things for you just to take away, to reflect on in relation to your churches. So power in Luke does not just simply reside with Jesus. It resides, as we've already seen, with John the Baptist, and also with significant others too, of course, one of whom is Mary. As we'll see a little bit later when we look at some art based on Luke's gospel, Luke is profoundly interested in the story of Mary. And Mary is portrayed in Luke's gospel as a powerful person because of the power of the Most High, which will overshadow her. And we get that there from Luke 1:35, the power of the Most High. And then that same power is voiced in the song that she sings, the Magnificat. We've got that there, Luke 1:46 to 56, sung often and said often in our churches, in our prayers and in our liturgies. It's a subversive song of challenge to worldly powers. Most obviously in 1:52, he has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. It's a song which has not been met kindly by many worldly powers down the ages. Okay, one thing to say about the Magnificat is it's the longest speech by a woman in the New Testament. When we talk about Mary being powerful, she really is. She has a powerful voice. And as I've said, it hasn't always been met with kindness. It was banned from church services in India under British rule, from public recitation in 1980s Guatemala, and in Argentina after the mothers of the disappeared used it to call for non-violence resistance to the ruling military junta in the 1970s. I think it's arguably the most censored Bible passage of the 20th century. Okay, because of what it could potentially spark off in the hearts and the minds and the imaginations of those who hear it. Okay, how might people hear these words? Where might these words lead people? So it's powerful stuff indeed. Just going to. Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, Rachel has said that she's intrigued by the themes of the rejection of power, and Elijah saying, I alone am left. Yeah, and how that applies to the church today. If we read the stories of Elijah, yes, the word power is never used of Elijah in the king cycle. And when we read those stories, there are some lows. There are some moments when Elijah has just had enough, feels utterly exhausted and isolated, and feels like God has abandoned him. And what happens in those moments? He is fed by ravens. He hears the still small voice. He's met by God and also surrounded by others who help him to get back up again and to continue in his ministry, and then have someone to hand it on to, of course, Elisha, which we'll come on to in a moment. So when we hear, of course, in the intertestamental period, what happens with a lot of the Old Testament figures, Moses, David, and Elijah, is that the people they are in the Old Testament kind of become more perfected versions of their original Old Testament selves, so to speak. So when we hear, for example, in the Psalms of Solomon, the hopes of the David who is to come, there is a line in the Psalms of Solomon which says he will never sin. And of course, if you read Samuel Kings, we know that the original David, of course, he sinned. You know, he was adulterous, murder, for goodness sake. So what we see is this kind of inflation of eschatological hopes, that are based on the people who have gone before. And I think it's good for us to go back to who those people were and to see actually they were human and they were limited too. So yes, there is absolutely hope for us too. Thank you, Rachel. Okay then, so we've talked about the power of Elijah, the power of John the Baptist, the power of Mary. John himself says, one who is more powerful than I is coming. You might think that this Elijah to come is as powerful as it's going to get. And John says, no, one more powerful than I is coming. Now, when we hear these words, it's easy to think, well, of course, John the Baptist is going to say that, isn't he? You know, he knows that Jesus is coming. But actually, in the early church, there was a huge John the Baptist following, as it were. And some scholars have kind of argued that John the Baptist was thought of as an angel. The word messenger, angelos in Greek, can be translated angel, and that some people could easily have misunderstood and taken John the Baptist for the Messiah to come. So when we hear these words, it's really important to recognize that John the Baptist is getting out of the way and laying down a power that he could have easily taken up and lived out. So what is this power then? The power to forgive, we'll come on to these in a moment, the power to heal, and the power over the powers of darkness. Okay, these are the three aspects of Jesus' power that we see manifest in Luke's gospel. And next to these, worldly powers, quite frankly, don't really seem to stand a chance, which is why I haven't mentioned them yet, but we will go on to that. Yeah, and thank you, Stephen, for that comment on Acts 6:8, a man full of God's grace and power. Yes, thank you. As I've said, power doesn't just belong to Jesus. Power belongs to those who follow Jesus and those who follow God's part in the salvation narrative that he has for them to play, like Mary. So let's think about healings. The word power is used quite a lot in the healing narratives. So as before, you might like to just have a little flick so that you've got a slightly wider view of these stories than the few verses that I've put on the slides. So here then we have the story of a paralyzed man who is being healed, okay? But in Luke 5:17, the power of the Lord was with him to heal. Okay, so it's power that enables Jesus to heal. And that power seems to be something that is actually experienced. It isn't notional, it's not abstract, it's something that Jesus seems to actually feel, maybe physically. So looking forward then into a generalized statement, a kind of summary statement that we find in Luke 6, verse 19. And all in the crowd were trying to touch him, for power came out from him and healed all of them. So something about the power going out. And then very beautifully in Luke 8, we have the story, Luke 8 towards the end, starting really at verse 40, with the woman who is healed of the bleeding. And she's determined to make physical contact with Jesus and pressing on through the crowds to touch him. And then in verse 46, Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I noticed that power had gone out from me." Yeah, so there is something about power that enables Jesus to heal. And that phrase is used in the collect for Luke, which Kate prayed at the start of our session. We'll think in a moment about what this might mean for our churches and what the challenges might be for us as we preach on these passages. Aligned to the stories of healings are stories of Jesus' encounters with demons. And Luke talks about unclean spirits, and Luke talks about demons. So going back to Luke 4, we'll see then in verse 36, again, this is the verse which I quoted earlier. It comes at the end of a story in which Jesus has healed somebody of something which is described as an unclean demon. Okay. Jesus' power over demons, over unclean spirits, is made clear in his interactions with them. So looking into verse 41, chapter 4, demons also came out of many, shouting, "You are the Son of God." But he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak. So Jesus' power over them, he has the power to allow them to speak or not to. And then the phrase that is used to describe miracles is this: deeds of power. There are a couple of verses there where that verse is used to describe what else might be described as miracles. Okay. Looking at the temptation of Jesus, which we find in Luke 4, as I say, Luke 4 is particularly kind of packed chapter in terms of the narrative and in terms of this kind of power conflict that we see between Jesus and the powers of darkness. We see the temptation, and then at the end of that, verse 14, then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. So what was the effect of the temptation onto Jesus? It was to actually empower him. Okay, it wasn't to weaken him, it was to empower him. And there is a sense in Luke's gospel that really the devil didn't have a chance, actually. Okay, the power of the church. Then Jesus called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. So here we see that conflation of power and authority, and the healing, we might say today, of body and of soul and of mind. Okay, in a moment when we think about the challenges for preaching and living the gospel, we might think about the challenge of putting this in words that people these days will relate to and make sense of. And that's a big challenge in preaching. But for now, we're just kind of noting what we find in the Bible. Okay, at the very end of Luke's gospel, we have these words, and see, I'm sending upon you what my Father promised. So stay here in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high. So power is the gift of the ascended, resurrected Jesus to the church. So one interesting question is this: if we read Elijah typology into the portrayal of Jesus in Luke, does that make the church Elisha in Acts? If you go back to the King's books and you read the story of Elijah, off he goes in his chariots of fire, and he gives the double portion of the Spirit to Elisha, who comes after him. Does that help frame what we read in the story of the church in Acts? And what about us? How do we see ourselves as part of this story? As I've said, worldly powers are held, I think, quite lightly in Luke's gospel, which I think might give us a little bit of hope and also maybe a little bit of perspective. When we think about power, our minds often do go to those who are in governance, who are in positions of leadership in the world. Luke's mind doesn't seem to go there at all. Actually, Luke seems to have a notion of power which is completely, it has no reference to titles or status or wealth. Okay, that doesn't mean that Luke is unaware of these things at all, quite the opposite. Luke, for example, names more officials in the Roman Empire than any other gospel. So if we look at the little verse, little note in 2, verses 1 to 2, in those days a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was in the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. So you don't find that level of detail elsewhere in any other gospel. Now, most people say that's because Luke's written a bit later, but it does also indicate that he has an eye to who is ruling. Okay, so when I say that he holds lightly to worldly power, that does not mean he is naive or ignorant of it at all. There is something in Luke's gospel that actually indicates that those who have worldly power simply can't understand the power of Jesus. So we hear a little bit of that in Luke 9, where we just have a mention of Herod there in chapter 9, verse 7. Now, when Herod the Tetrarch heard about all that had taken place, he was perplexed. He doesn't understand what's going on here. Okay, so already we've heard about this power of Elijah that is coming into the world. We've heard about the power of John the Baptist, the power of Mary, the power of Jesus, the power that is being given to the disciples to heal, to cast out demons, and yet this power is completely beyond the comprehension of the person who is ostensibly in charge. Okay. And there is something there that we might want to think about for ourselves as Christians and for our churches. Now, there's conflict in all 4 Gospels. You'll find it in different ways in all of the Gospels, okay? So in Matthew, there's a very obvious conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, and that really comes to a head in Matthew 23, where Jesus denounces the Pharisees again and again and again as hypocrites. In John's Gospel, really quite trickily, the conflict is between Jesus and the Jews. And some people have tried to address the potential anti-Semitic implications of this by translating that Greek word Judeans rather than Jews. But nonetheless, there was a conflict there all the way through John's Gospel. In Mark's Gospel, it seems much more to do with the conflict between Jesus and the demons, the powers of darkness. And I would say that in Luke's Gospel, the conflict is a kind of slow burn. So that mention that we hear of Herod in chapter 9, he's largely been absent really throughout the Gospel until that point. Okay, so and with regards to Jesus' relationships with other Jewish groups, there's one interesting thing to note, which is that the Pharisees in Luke 13 try to protect Jesus. They recognize that he is in danger. And so this just comes in Luke 13, Luke 13, verse 31. At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." Okay, so we just need to be aware of that in our preaching. It's very easy to take the Matthean approach and to say that the Pharisees are always the enemies of Jesus. Actually, it seems a bit more nuanced than that. And again, there are scholars who have argued that maybe Jesus himself could be described as a Pharisee. So maybe what we see in Matthew's gospel is a kind of intra-Pharisaic argument rather than a clash between two completely different cultures, which does paint Matthew 23 in a whole different light, really. Okay, so we get then to verse 47 of Luke 19, which is where we start to see this conflict gathering pace. Okay, every day he was teaching in the temple. The chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people kept looking for a way to kill him, but they did not find anything they could do, for all the people were spellbound by what they heard. Okay, so there's a sense of Jesus' power protecting him from the harm that those in authority, in worldly authority, would like to do to him. It's not until Judas betrays Jesus a couple of chapters later in Luke 22, verse 3, that it seems that Jesus is actually in any real danger, because so far, all the way through the gospel, he's been protected. But then there's this moment in Luke 22, 3, then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was one of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers of the temple police about how he might betray them to him. And there's this kind of sense that actually Judas here has his own power, which is then abused and used against Jesus. But were it not for that, then the worldly powers would have no chance with Jesus whatsoever. And we hear something of that in Jesus' rather kind of plaintive cry in verse 53, later on in the same chapter. So this is where Jesus meets the chief priests, the officers of the temple police, and the elders who have come for him. He says, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a bandit? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness." And I think we need to do something. We need to take seriously this language that is used in Luke 22 of darkness and of Satan, who is named in Luke 22, 3. Of course, you might well know that the word Satan means opponent. Yeah, it's a common noun in Hebrew. It's not kind of given a capital S until much later, in fact. But there's this sense that an oppositional force has come into Jesus' life through one of his friends, and this has brought darkness and will bring Jesus death. Okay. We're going to have a little moment to think about how we might apply this to our churches. But that's something then about Jesus. And before we move on to John himself, of course, the story does not end with the death of Jesus. As you know so well, we have the power of the resurrection, which breaks through and shows itself to be infinitely greater than the powers of darkness that led to Jesus' death. So that leads us then to Luke 24, the dazzling clothes that we see of the angels, the women terrified, bowed to the ground. Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Okay. And there is something about the inevitability of Jesus' suffering that we hear in the story of the walk to Emmaus, that wonderfully kind of poignant story. Okay. And if you look down into Luke 24, it was necessary for these things to happen. Okay, they the two disciples, only one of whom is named, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know these things that have taken place in these days?" And then they describe what's happened. "We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." Okay. And then going down to that, I think that one of the most beautiful verses really in Luke 24:26. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? So the inevitability of Jesus suffering in order to fulfill what he has spoken in Luke 4. What does it really mean for the Spirit of the Lord to anoint you, to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour? That's going to mean suffering, and that is going to mean death, and it's going to mean resurrection. And that's what we see beautifully articulated in Luke 24. It's interesting, by the way, to think about how this then plays out in Acts and the interactions between, for example, most notably Paul and the various officials and worldly leaders, and the number of times that Paul finds himself in hot water, and then things happen, angels show up, he finds the right words to say, and he's released. There is something there about the power that inhabits Paul and others in Acts, being no match really for the worldly powers of the Roman Empire. So what about Luke himself? Sorry, let's just focus. Charles has said, yes, the opposition to Jesus. Just notice that his forecast of being handed over in Luke only references Gentiles, excludes priests and scribes. Yeah, it's really interesting to note those kind of things and to think, okay, what might be going on there then? To note the maybe small details between the synoptic gospels. And that will give us an idea of some of the power dynamics that are at play in the various gospels. Let's think then, we are going to break soon, about Luke himself. We've thought so far about Jesus. Luke was a powerful man. Okay, there's a really important book that was written, The Social World of Luke Acts, was written in 1991 by a couple of social scientists who do a lot of work to put together what can we know about the implied author of Luke and Acts, which of course they put together, as most scholars through the 20th century have. So the implied author is the one about whom we can infer this and that and the other through a close and careful reading of the text, which may or may not match up to the author's own self-expression. Okay, so how can you pick up on clues to know something about this person? So the implied author, say Nere and Melina, is someone who has a wide geographic spread of experience across the Roman world, okay, who seems to be speaking to urban elite adults from places as far as Rome and Jerusalem. Now, you might know that biblical scholars spend a lot of time trying their best to locate not only when the Gospels were written, but where they may have been written. So, for example, Mark's Gospel is often associated with Rome, and it's kind of thought to belong more to the western side of the Roman Empire. And some people might argue that John seems to inhabit a more eastern Roman Empire kind of dualism in the way that he uses language. Luke seems to have the ability to travel widely, okay? He seems to know a lot about what is going on across the Roman Empire. And of course, we see this in all of the travel narratives in Acts. Carl Alan Kuhn has written a great little book, and it's just simply called Luke, the Elite Evangelist. That's how he summarizes who Luke is. Okay, there are some distinctly Lucan sources. We'll look at this after the break, but there are lots of little pericopes, little segments of text which are unique to Luke, which raise the issues of reconciliation service and understanding the value of the poor. Now, this raises the question, to whom is Luke speaking here? Okay, which leads us on to this question. Oops, sorry, let me find the next slide. How does Luke use his power? Okay, if Luke is an elite evangelist, if he is wealthy enough to travel, or he is well connected enough to travel, or if he is well educated enough to write as beautifully as he does, and we'll think much more about that after the break, the kind of fluency and beauty of Luke's Greek, then he is somebody of significant power and agency. What does he do with that? Okay, because when we think about power, we think about capacity to do something. The image I used at the start of this session of somebody running a marathon, what do we use our physical power to do? Do we use it to run a marathon? Do we use it to climb a mountain? Do we use it to work a 15-hour day, or whatever it might be? Yeah. So what does Luke do with his significant powers of wealth, status, education? He focuses on the poor. Okay, so here we have some of the many references to the poor in Luke's gospel. And there is a question which I think is worth pondering, which is this: when we think of Luke's gospel, we very often think of it as a gospel for the poor. Okay, and that can sound like this is a gospel that has been written for the poor. I'm not sure that we can take that for granted, actually. It might be that we could just as equally argue that this is a gospel for the rich. Okay, here is one elite, well-connected, wealthy, well-educated person speaking to other well-educated, wealthy, well-connected people, and encouraging them and challenging them to look differently at the rest of the world, and to look particularly on those whose experiences of lives are not as privileged as their own. So when we think about our churches, it might be that within our churches think of themselves as poor. There's lots of talk, isn't there, in the Church of England about the squeeze on institutional finance. And that is undoubtedly a reality with which we're living. Nonetheless, it might be that individual Christians might be less poor, depending on where we are, depending on our community and our church family. It might be that actually we have people among us who are pretty well educated, who are pretty well resourced, well supplied for, who are living comfortably into old age. How do we encourage and challenge people to look to the poor and to understand their own agency well enough that they understand that they can do something with what has been given to them? Okay, now as I say, these slides will be made available to you. And so all of these references can be followed up on later. And thank you, Sarah, for that comment. We're going to be thinking about Luke as a physician after our break, but I think it would be really good to have the opportunity just to kind of draw a breath and say, oh, that was a lot, wasn't it? What might this mean for me as a preacher? What might this mean for my church? What might be really challenging, actually? It might be that preaching about stories of healing are a real challenge in churches with people who suffer and go on suffering and go on praying and yet still suffer. How do we respond to that? How do we use the language of demons and Satan and darkness? What do we do with that language? Okay, how do we help people to understand their power in the world? How do we help people to live the gospel so that it might change their view of what real power might really look like from the perspective of the heavens? So, Kate, would you be able to put us back into breakout groups? Is that okay? And if we could have the same groups as before, so just pick up those questions. There's been so much in this morning's session, so I'll leave it to you to kind of go with all of this where you will, and I hope that you have a really rich conversation. Do make some notes, I would encourage you, because then you can come back to those as you prepare for your work in this year to come.
Sure. So how long do we want in the groups, Lucy?
Let's take us right up to the break. Let's have eight minutes, Kate, please.
Sorry, Lucy, I missed that. It glitched.
Sorry, can we have 8 minutes? It will take us
Yeah,
right
of
up to the
course.
break. Thank you.
Yep, that's fine. Okey-dokey. There we go.
Storyteller. Thank you, Kate. So I'm going to share my screen again. And as I said earlier, there's a lot to hear. There's a lot to ponder. After our next break, we're going to have a session in which we're basically going to look at some nice pictures and hear some poetry. So that might feel less intellectually arduous. In this section, you might hear some reminders of things that you have learned, have studied, have written about in years, either recently or not so recently. So this might remind you of some things about Luke as a gospel and Luke as a gospel writer. So one thing that's often said about New Testament Greek is that it's rough and ready. So Koine Greek, people say this in preaching all the time, not all the time, very often. It's the kind of Greek that is the street Greek. It's not the Attic classic Greek that we hear, for example, in the wonderful poetry and drama of Homeric Greek. Okay, it's a little bit lesser than that, and that's actually true, to be honest with you. But that doesn't mean that it's altogether terrible, okay? Because quite often the move that's made in preaching is to say Koine Greek is rough and ready. It's how people on the street used language, and therefore that's what we should do too. Okay, that's kind of true, and it's kind of not. For one thing, the language that was spoken on the street, of course, wasn't Greek. Greek was a written language. The spoken language, of course, was Aramaic in Palestine in the 1st century. So there's already a work of translation in translating the New Testament into Greek rather than keeping it in the spoken language of Aramaic. So there's, when we look at the Gospels, we are looking at works written by a minority of people. Most people in the 1st century were illiterate. We don't know exactly the proportion of people who are illiterate. It's impossible to tell with any historical accuracy, but the most kind of estimates put it around something like 80 to 90% of people in the Roman Empire could neither read nor write. That's why, for example, Paul's letters were read aloud, from one community and sent from one community to another. Those who would be reading aloud to a community would be people of education and status, and therefore that would give them a special role to play. We can take these things for granted when we live in a country in which most people, we can assume, can read and write. That was not the case at all at the time at which Luke was writing. And Luke's gospel is written in particularly beautiful Greek. In particular, he seems to be pulling out all the stops in the prologue, starting strong with a beautifully poetic prologue which lays out what he's going to do and establishes himself as the author. It's a beautiful sentence in Greek. And actually, if you have a look at it in the English NRSV, what you will notice is that even in the English translation, the prologue is all one long sentence. That's deliberate. It's beautiful and flowing with many clauses to it, okay? And immediately, the words that Luke is using to describe what he's doing is, the Greek word is diegesis, which simply means narrative, okay? So that's translated in the NRSV as accounts, but not more normally in Greek, that would be used to talk about a kind of narrative. Okay, an orderly narrative. Both of those words are of great significance, and I'm going to say a little bit more about the significance of the order a little bit later. But for now, let's note that Luke is self-consciously writing a narrative. Okay, one thing to bear in mind is that the word gospel isn't used at all in Luke. It is used in the other synoptic gospels. It's not used in Luke. That's just quite interesting. So Luke 1 verse 3, to write an orderly diegesis for you, most excellent Theophilus. Now it seems to be that Luke is directly addressing his patron, okay, the one who has sponsored the writing of this literary work. Then, as now, writers needed to earn money to put food in their mouths and a roof over their heads. And that was certainly the case in the first century. There was a strong, robust system of patronage. And therefore, it's historically plausible to say, yes, Luke is writing for a real person called Theophilus, which was a real name in the first century. Now, some people have taken a more kind of metaphoric view of this and said, well, actually, if you look at the word Theophilus, it's a name, but it means lover of God. So maybe this is written to everybody who is going to be reading the gospel. I'll leave that with you to decide how plausible you think that is. Now, one really important question is this: for whom is Luke writing? We've already considered the possibility that Luke might be writing for the rich to challenge them with the challenge of Jesus to care for the poor. Okay. Now, one word that's really important is the last word of the prologue, instructed. Okay, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. Now, the word that's used there is catechesis. Okay, you have received catechesis, you have received instruction. Now, that's a word that is still used in our churches to talk about things like confirmation classes, the kind of induction learning into the Christian faith that people do at various points in their lives in preparation either for baptism or confirmation, normally in the Church of England. In the early church, people underwent catechesis before they were baptized. Easter Sunday was a big baptism day in the early church. And before that, there was a period of learning so that people might embrace wholeheartedly the baptism which they were about to receive. So Luke is writing for people who, by implication, have been baptized. Yeah, that's worth noticing. That Luke isn't necessarily writing for those who are on the outside of the Christian community. He's writing for those on the inside. Okay, so looking on then, you might have seen this kind of diagram before in textbooks when you trained for the ministry which you exercise. But of course, it's always worth looking at this and noting once again that Luke is related to Mark and to Matthew and to John, actually, in different kind of ways. But we have these three gospels, the synoptic gospels, looking together and repeating to a very great degree, really, the material of the stories of Jesus. And what you'll see here is that with Luke's gospel, 35% of it you won't find anywhere else. We'll have a look at what some of that material is in a little while. But as you can see, that's much more than Mark has. And of course, that's because most scholars say that Mark was written first, and therefore Luke and Matthew are drawing on Mark as a source for their gospels. 20% of Matthew is unique. And again, it's worth looking at what that is and therefore what that says about the particular concerns that Matthew is addressing and maybe the particular people to whom he is addressing his gospel. But it's worth just reminding ourselves of this. And I'd really encourage you, actually, when you get ready to preach, do have somewhere either on your bookshelves or online a gospel synopsis so that you can look and see how does this passage, which is set for this Sunday, relate to Mark and Matthew? What does Luke do with it, which is different, which is unique, which is maybe a bit strange, maybe a bit interesting? Okay, so I just encourage you not to kind of lose sight of that as you prepare to preach and do things. But thinking for a moment about what a gospel actually is, because again, it's easy to take these words for granted and to assume that we think we know what they mean. Lots of ideas have been thrown up over the course of the 20th century as theologians have tried to define what a gospel is. The word gospel was kind of first used in the 2nd century to talk of the stories about Jesus. And not only those that became part of the canon of Scripture, but also those that were deemed to be not a true witness to the authentic Jesus, such as the Gospel of Peter and so on. But that word gospel really is this kind of 2nd century invention. So what are we looking at here? Are they biographies? There was a time when this idea was really doubted. For example, people would say, well, actually, if you look at a biography, what you find is quite a lot of kind of psychological background on the person about whom this biography is written. So there'll be a focus on that person's birth, their family, their childhood. You don't really get any of that in any of the Gospels. You get kind of the hidden years, which can cause great frustration, really, for many people. And that's where, for example, the Gospel of Peter kind of tries to fill in some of the blanks by telling some stories about the boy Jesus, to fill in that blank. So Richard Burridge and others more recently have said, actually, you're coming at this entirely from the wrong perspective. You're thinking about modern biographies, and actually ancient biographies were completely different. They were much less interested in somebody's birth. They were much more interested in somebody's death. Okay, so how somebody dies is going to tell you everything you need to know about the value of that person's life. Okay, and you see that, for example, in some of the biographies that are written in the Greek and Roman period. And of course, the other thing to say is that modern biographies are very post-Freudian, since Freud's insights into psychology, some of which you might want to question, rightly so. The great gift of Freudian psychology is to understand the great significance of our early years on our development. And of course, it's obvious that none of the gospel writers were Freudians. They lived many centuries before him. And of course, one thing to say about biographies is that they are all edited. There will always be a process of selectivity, selecting the stories, the incidents, the relationships, the connections, which are really important in understanding somebody. So we're talking about a biography. I would say maybe the answer could be a kind of yes, but we need to think about them in terms of ancient biographies, not modern ones. In the middle decades of the 20th century, as you might know, there was a big move to demythologize the Gospels, to get rid of all the supernatural elements which modern people find so tricky to understand. So all of that stuff about Satan and demons would be translated into terms to do with mental health, for example. And so people like Rudolf Bultmann, Martin Dibelius, also Paul Tillich as well, were kind of part of this process of saying, actually, how then do we understand Gospels if we want to demythologize them? Well, what we need to do is to recognize the genre and to recognize that they are something like a kind of folk story, which are handed on from one generation to the next. Now, some people say, well, actually, they are a unique genre because nothing really existed in the same period, which is a kind of absolute parallel with these. So yes, there are stories of the deaths of great men, of valor, but there's nothing really that kind of matches up entirely. So, for example, you have stories, you have you have the kind of action stories, if you like, of war and victory and dying in glory, and then you have the kind of the sayings of the sages, the wisdom sayings, which are often kind of collated in collections together, not dissimilarly to the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, but to put them together, as we find in the Gospels, where you have the sayings of Jesus alongside the stories of Jesus. That's kind of a unique thing, really. Historiography. So David Orne is a New Testament scholar who's done some brilliant work on the book of Revelation in particular. And he says, actually, maybe what we need to be thinking is looking at the Gospels in terms of a narrative based on historical events, with particular eye to the community who finds themselves as the inheritors of this story. So he talks about the important historical experiences of a single national group from their origin to the recent past. Okay, so the word that's often used is etiology, how a particular group of people find their identity by tracing their identity back to their origins. And you get all these kind of stories. David Orne is there talking in national terms, but you also get these stories within local communities, within families, even among couples, the story of how we met, our first dates. That's a kind of etiology that will be repeated and repeated and repeated because it's important, because it encapsulates the value of the relationship by talking about where it all started. And of course, that's what the Exodus story does in the Old Testament, is this great etiology for the emergence of Israel as a single nation. So Luke as a storyteller. Luke is indeed a great storyteller. If you read through Luke and Acts, you will see so many aspects of writing parables that are unique to Luke. Sorry, the formatting went a bit wrong there. But like I said earlier, 35% of Luke isn't found elsewhere in the other Gospels. Here are some examples of what some of these unique Lucan materials are. So we have stories to do with restoration. We have stories to do with righteousness. We have stories to do with the rich and the poor. We have stories to do with justice and judgment. And as we look at these, if we had longer, we could kind of linger over them and see, what is it about these stories? What do these stories say that Luke really wants us to know about the person of Jesus? As we read, especially as if we put Luke and Acts together, which, as I say, nearly all biblical scholars have done since 1927, then what we see is this great kind of sense of character, of drama, of conflict, of very beautiful language that is used, of speeches. If we look at the rhetoric that we find in Acts, if we find these humorous moments that we get in the book of Acts, Luke knows what he's doing as a writer. Luke, as is often mentioned, is traditionally known as a doctor. Amongst other things, he's patron saint of doctors. He's also the patron saint of artists, as we'll see after our next break. Where does this come from, this idea that Luke is a doctor? Okay. Colossians mentions somebody called Luke. If you want to have a quick flick to Colossians, you'll see it there. Colossians 4, verse 14, describes the beloved physician. And that's a phrase that's already been used this morning. It's made its way into many prayers and liturgies. Now, an interesting thing is what comes immediately before this mention of Luke, the beloved physician. So this starts Colossians 4, verse 10. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justus, greets you. These are the only ones of the circumcision among my co-workers for the kingdom of God, and they have been a comfort to me. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ Jesus, greets you, and so on, so on. 14, Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Now, the interesting thing here is that we have a whole lot of people who are mentioned in Colossians 4, verses 10 and 11, who are the only ones of the circumcision. That's made pretty clear. And if you know your Galatians, you will know what that means. You will know that that means that these are Jewish people who have come to believe in Jesus as the Messiah. Therefore, when we read down about people like Epaphras and Demas, and indeed Luke and so on, therefore, by implication, are we given to expect that Luke is a Gentile? Okay, now this raises a big question, because it's easy enough to say, well, obviously, yes. But then we look back at Luke's gospel and we see how absolutely steeped he is in the scriptures of Israel. As you probably know, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, a long project which took a good 100 years, sort of 300, 200 BCE, and that's known as the Septuagint. And when you read the, particularly actually the birth and the infancy narratives of Jesus in Luke, what we see again and again and again are not just quotes from the Septuagint, which are perfectly verbatim, absolutely right, but also these profound kind of allusions and evocations of characters and verses. This suggests somebody who has been absolutely imbibing the scriptures year after year after year of their life. So if this is a Gentile, this is somebody who has profoundly become part of the story of Israel without actually being circumcised. It might be that he is a Gentile who's been converted by the preaching of Paul. That's something that's quite often suggested. After all, Paul is the hero of the book of Acts. His conversion then kind of sets the stage for most of the action that will take place for most of the book of Acts. Or is he a God-fearer? So we hear about these people in the New Testament who were Gentiles, who were an active and regular part of synagogue life, and yet who were never circumcised. We might think, as a kind of rough and ready analogy, people who might come to our churches, be there every Sunday, but would never call themselves Christians and never be baptized, or so on. So is this somebody who's drawn to the scriptures of Israel, or is it someone who could only acquire that depth of knowledge by being brought up Jewish? As I say, I'm not going to tell you the answer, but it is a tricky question. It's a genuinely tricky question. Okay, so a couple of early sources. That's really what we find. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention Philemon. It's just worth noting that these other letters of the New Testament also mention somebody called Luke. And if you look those verses up, what you'll see really intriguingly is that Dunamis is mentioned again. And so it's clear that there is a kind of a relationship between these people. Is that Luke, who is mentioned in Colossians, Philemon and 2 Timothy, also the Luke who wrote the gospel? Okay, there might be a question there to do with dating as well, when we think Luke was written and when we think that these letters of the New Testament might be written. And on the whole, all of these texts are, in terms of scholarly consensus, thought to be later within the writing of the New Testament corpus. So Philemon's the only one that's really kind of contested, and there are some people who say actually this represents kind of quite early Pauline theology in action. Colossians on the whole is thought to be probably later, probably post-Pauline. Some people, actually John Muddiman notably believes that it has as its kind of skeleton the lost letter to Laodicea, which is then kind of fleshed out and then it becomes a letter to the Colossians. He would certainly date it later than the death of Paul. And 2 Timothy also is dated a bit later, and that's to do with the way in which the church is kind of portrayed as being a bit more organized than it is, for example, in the kind of melee of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. So Luke on the whole also is thought to be a bit later. I think, yes, we'll come on to that in a moment. But it's worth just kind of noting here that there are mentions of somebody called Luke that are kind of dotted around the letters of the New Testament. So so also from the early church, we'll start with Clement because he's the earliest chronologically really important bishop who wrote a really influential letter. He believed that Luke and Matthew were the first Gospels to be written while Peter and Paul were still alive, hence the kind of the vividness and the immediacy of the testimony. And also he works from the premise that the Gospels contained in the genealogies were written first. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? Irenaeus of Lyon, another bishop in the 2nd century, he notes that Luke has these narratives in Acts which are stories of travels, the kind of ship seafaring stories. And he says, actually, Luke really was there with Paul, or what's often called the we passages, because it says, we went here, we did this, we did that, we met so-and-so. So Irenaeus believes that Luke really was with Paul when he wrote that. He believes that there is this kind of balancing act that goes on between Matthew and Luke, that Luke is writing in order to kind of correct Matthew's portrayal of Jesus. And this is interesting, to locate Paul's teaching in the life of Jesus, which is an interesting thing to kind of ponder. If you read Paul's kind of kerygma, his gospel, what does Paul really believe? Well, Paul really believes that in Jesus, the way has been made clear for Gentiles to become part of the covenant people of God. That's a very new perspective reading of Paul. How do you locate that in the life of Jesus? That's really what you can see going on in Luke's gospel. In so many ways, Gentiles coming to believe in Jesus. Just one tiny mention, we could think about the centurion whose servant is healed. Okay, so that's a couple of ideas. Going forward a couple of hundred years, St. Jerome, of course, the great interpreter, translator of the scriptures, Luke, a physician of Antioch. That's interesting, isn't it? I kind of said earlier that the attempts to locate the Gospels, not only in time, but also in space, lead people to all sorts of ideas. Jerome believed that Luke was located around the eastern end of the Roman Empire, as his writings indicate. That's interesting. Was not unskilled in the Greek language. And he notes also that Luke is mentioned in Colossians. And just a couple of things there from Augustine. Okay, one thing to note about Augustine is that Augustine believed that Matthew was written first, and Augustine's ordering of the dating of the Gospels sets the ordering that we have in our Bibles now, which is why we have Matthew first. Yeah, and so Augustine says, you know, it was God's plan that those also who were nothing more than followers of the first apostles should have authority given them not only to preach the gospel, but to compose an account of it in writing. I refer to Mark and Luke there. So yes, he sees Luke as somebody who kind of takes up the mantle and writes as part of God's plan. So a few things about when then Luke was written and how we arrive at the conclusion that we do. There are two manuscripts which can be helpful in dating the gospel. There's one that's known as P75, which is a papyrus codex, and that's been dated to around kind of 175 to 225 CE. And then we have another one, the Muratorian canon, which is not dissimilar, around 170 to 190. Now, what these are complete texts of the gospel. They're kind of pristinely perfect. And the scholarly consensus is that they didn't arrive at that state of completion from nothing, that there would have been a kind of process of telling and repeating the stories of Jesus and telling and sharing of fragments that would then be kind of put together, which then would have led to this wonderful complete text. And so scholars kind of say, okay, therefore, if we bear all of this in mind, then this means that the latest realistic date by which Luke could have been written would have been early in the 2nd century. Okay, and some scholars do think that Luke was written early on in the 2nd century. That's about as late as anyone realistically dates it. By the way, nobody kind of says, oh, Luke was a great forgery that was written in the 5th century or anything like that. You don't get that anywhere among biblical scholars. I think John Muddiman is kind of a representative of the kind of outer edges, really, of the dating of Luke's gospel. So that's when is the latest it could have been written, maybe somewhere around kind of 120-ish, which might be the rough, depending on when you think Revelation might have been written, might be similar kind of timing, if not a bit later to that. That's another story though. What about the earliest date? So the terminus postquem, using the Latin there. Well, if we go with most people and say, let's assume that Mark was written first, and if we say Mark was written around 67 to 72, either just before or just after the fall of Jerusalem, then Luke must have been written after that. And therefore, on that basis, most scholars would say Luke was probably written around 80 to 90. I'm quite influenced by the idea that in the early church, as I say, most people are illiterate, and most people hear the stories of Jesus by people telling them to them. And therefore, speaking is the normal and widespread mode of communication. Okay, and you get this sometimes in the epistles of the New Testament, Paul saying, I wish I could come to you, and then we could actually talk, but I can't, so I'm gonna have to write you a letter, and it's not as good as my actual presence, but there we are, you know, in with God's help, I'll come to you soon. And so I'm personally quite influenced by the idea that in the early church, the first generation of Christians would have told the stories of Jesus all the time, and they would have passed those stories on. And therefore, it's the point at which the generations of Christians who would have known Jesus and who would have known the first disciples starts to die out, that it then becomes a pastoral need to write down the stories of Jesus for those who will have no living memory of them. And I think that for me helps to make sense of this timing, not to say that this is some kind of later kind of conspiracy of power. I don't think there's anything, there's no need to read that into it at all. But I think we need to understand that actually most people in the first century were not literary people. Literary works were not their mode of communication of choice. They only used them when they needed to, and they relied on a small number of specialists to help them do this. And therefore, yes, to preserve for posterity stories that had been shared widely orally, I think makes perfect sense of the dating of arguably all of the Gospels. So, Luke, the beloved physician, is he a real doctor? Okay, we hear this often, and of course we've got that quote from Colossians, the beloved physician. Was he a real doctor? Paula Gooder is skeptical about this. She says, I'm not sure. She said this in one of her talks. Luke's probably not a doctor, she says, because he doesn't really focus on healing any more than any of the other gospel writers. If you look at the stories of healings, you find those in Matthew, you find them in Mark, you find them in John. So what makes Luke any different? I would say to Paula, with all respect, that we need to look a bit more closely at the vocabulary that's used in Luke's healing narratives, because he seems to know words that no other gospel writer knows. So I've got a couple here. For example, there's a word that's used in the healing narrative in Luke 13, bent over. He's the only person in the New Testament who seems to know that word. Not only does he use words that nobody else seems to know, he uses words that other doctors do know. So the Corpus Hippocratum was the kind of medical textbook, if you like, of the ancient world. And some of the unique Lucan vocabulary comes straight out of the Corpus Hippocratum. So one of those words, for example, is dropsy, hydropikos, which is used in 14 verse 2. And also in the infancy narratives, when Luke talks about the pregnancies, both of Mary and Elizabeth, he uses medical terminology. He uses kind of gynecological language. So there is, I think, quite an argument to say it's feasible to say that, yes, Luke was a real doctor. One thing we need to bear in mind, of course, we need to get ourselves, if we can, out of a kind of British 2021 context in which being a doctor confers a certain amount of status. We've already said that Luke was probably somebody of high status, but we need to just bear in mind that being a doctor in and of itself didn't necessarily confer social status or imply any particular social class. It was actually possible to be a slave doctor in the Roman Empire, although what they could do was quite limited. They treated, but they were not able to diagnose. So it's worth just kind of bearing in mind that when we use these words, we need to have in mind something of the first century rather than our own. I'll just pull out a couple of things from here. As I say, if you're interested, you can have these slides and you can look up these verses in a kind of a more in a deeper way. But it's worth saying that actually Luke really does know his vocabulary. And again, a few things that are worth saying. Does Luke portray Jesus as the greater physician? And that comes from a moment in Luke chapter 17, verses 11 to 19. This is the cleansing of the 10 lepers that we find, where they are made clean by Jesus. So Jesus is portrayed here as being able to do what other doctors are not able to do. And we get that also in the woman with the bleeding. And then also Luke quotes this proverb in 4:23, physician, heal yourself. That's not found in the other Gospels too. Does Luke know that proverb because he's heard it, because he's a doctor? It's worth just pondering these things. One thing that's worth just noting is that this doesn't play out very much in the Passion narrative. We might think that if Luke is a real doctor, and if he uses medical terminology to describe healing narratives and elsewhere in the gospel, then that's going to influence how he tells the story of Jesus' sufferings and Jesus' death. But actually, not really is the answer. And it's worth maybe pondering why that might be so. Okay, we've got a few more things to think about, because I want to get us on to thinking about how our churches might find themselves in the story of Jesus as we see it in Luke Acts. So as I said, Luke and Acts have been put together. Henry Cadbury wrote a very influential book in 1927 where he basically said, listen, Luke and Acts are designed to be read together. It's a 2-volume work. And so you can't understand Acts without Luke and vice versa. And that kind of set the stage for a lot of narrative criticism of Luke Acts. Because if you say, okay, Luke is only half of the story, and then you've got Acts as the other half, which I think does lend itself to the Elijah-Elisha typology, then what's going on in there? Okay, so Luke sees Jesus as the eschatological figure, back to Elijah, who's going to bring about the redemption of Jerusalem. And that language of redemption, restoration is used both at the start and at the end of the gospel. Okay, so thinking back to the road to Emmaus, we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Okay, so that kind of chimes in with what we see there in Luke 2:38. Another really influential book is from a German scholar, Hans Conselmann, The Middle of Time. It's translated into English as The Theology of St. Luke, but I think that the German title is so much more pertinent and exactly to the point, because what Hans Conselmann is saying is what Jesus does by coming into the world is he divides time into 2. So you basically have, as we have in our in our chronology, BC and AD, time has been split in half by the coming of Jesus. And therefore, what we have in salvation history is we have what Conselmann calls the time of Israel. And you hear those stories in the Old Testament. You have the time of Jesus. This is a kind of epicenter of history, of time. And that's what you have in the Gospels. And then you have the time of the church. And that starts in Acts, and then it continues. Okay, so another German theologian picks up on this idea as he writes his book in 1962, Christ and Time, to say actually what's going on here is a kind of a dunamis, a power that is sending people along the path of God's salvation to the world that is being worked out. So the word that's used often in theology is teleological understanding of time. A time that has a goal, that has a purpose to it. So the Greek word telos means aim, it means goal. Okay, so an understanding of life, which is teleological, is an understanding which says there is a drive which is powered by a purpose that God is working out. And that can be used of people's own individual lives, of the life of a church, of the life of the world. And certainly Kuhlman sees that happening in Luke Acts, which leads him to ask the question, so why is Luke Acts written then? Okay, we've noticed already it's been written for those who've received instruction, therefore those who are baptized, therefore he's written for believers. Maybe, especially if we think that Luke was written a bit later, maybe it was written in the 80s, the 90s, maybe the first generation of Christians are dying out and people are starting to lose hope. Where is this Jesus who promised us that he would return? We see no sign of him. Has he forgotten his promise? Has God turned out not to be faithful after all? And so Kuhlman believes that actually Luke Acts is written to assure people that God hasn't forgotten his promise, that what's called the delayed parousia, the time lag between the ascension of Jesus into heaven and the coming again of Jesus is not to make fools of them all, but rather it's an opportunity to look for and become part of the story of salvation that's being worked out as the Spirit sends people to the ends of the earth as they await the second coming. Okay, and it's worth looking and noticing that if it were not for Luke, we wouldn't have the story of the ascension. That's part of the unique Lucan material. It's not in any of the other Gospels, and it's important enough to be in there twice. It's at the end of Luke and the start of Acts. And of course, what it does is to assure people that Jesus is coming back. So, yeah. This is all quite important stuff as we think of our own parts in the story. So in Luke's Gospel, if you can kind of imagine a set of kind of little Russian dolls, you have stories. You have stories like, for example, the story of the prodigal son. And that says something powerful and beautiful about what it means to be found and known and loved and welcomed into the family of God. So that's a story within a story, which is the story of Luke's Gospel, which is in a story of Luke Acts, which Luke, I believe, sees himself very much as an inheritor of a tradition. If we think back to the prologue, he says, actually, I'm not the first person to write. Many people have undertaken to write about Jesus. Yeah. And like I say, I could say so much more about this, but the way in which he doesn't quote the Old Testament as often and as explicitly as Matthew does, but there is so much in Luke's Gospel that evokes the characters and the verses of the Old Testament. And Luke clearly sees himself as writing as part of the big story of God's salvation for the world. And the word that's often used is the German word Heilsgeschichte. Obviously, German theologians have had such a huge impact on theology since the 1800s. But the idea is that there is a story that is being told and that goes on being told, and it's the story of God's salvation for all the world. So a theological theme is that of recapitulation. And this is how the early church, part of the early church anyway, understood how the story of God's salvation for the world was being worked out. And it's very much in tune with this idea from Hans Conselmann that time has been kind of split in two, and time finds its epicenter, its center of gravity in the life of Jesus. So if you kind of have that in mind, what we can then say is something along the lines of what Irenaeus says. So Irenaeus, hugely important apologist in the 2nd century. Apologists, of course, people who give rational explanations for anything, but in our particular case, for Christian faith. So he's talking here about Justin Martyr, who is denouncing Marcion. Marcion, as you might know, believes that most of the Bible isn't to be trusted, and that it needs to be, very, very, very heavily edited until only the bits that he agrees with are left. Not that anyone does that these days, but there we are. So he says, where are we? Let me just find this. And yeah, so this comes from a really important document from the 2nd centuries against the heresies. In his book Against Marcion the Heretic, Justin does well say, I would not have believed the Lord himself if he had announced any other than who he is, our framer, maker, and nourisher. But because the only begotten Son came to us from the one God who both made this world and formed us, and contains and administers all things, summing up his own handiwork in himself, my faith towards him is steadfast, and my love to the Father immovable, God bestowing both upon us. Now that word summing up, he's writing there in Greek. The word is recapitulation, okay? And the idea here is that what we have in the story of the Bible is a story initially of God creating the world good, but then pretty quickly things going wrong, okay? So Adam, Eve, the fall, the expulsion from Eden, and all that comes after, the horrible murder, Cain and Abel, the terrible things that kind of follow, and the failure of God's people to live up to the promises and the covenant of God down the ages, the exile, and so on. What we kind of see is a story of things going wrong. But then what we see in Jesus is a putting right of what went wrong. And that idea of the putting right of what went wrong, that's the idea that's at the heart of this theological notion of recapitulation. Okay, summing up. And we see that also echoed in the Christ hymn in Colossians 1. Okay, and here you see a really obvious and kind of classic example of that by another writing of Irenaeus, the demonstration of the apostolic preaching. He says, because it was necessary, again, that idea that things need to happen, and that Adam should be recapitulated in Christ, that's the Pauline language of Jesus as the second Adam, so that what was mortal might be engulfed by immortality it was necessary also for Eve to be recapitulated in Mary, so that a virgin, by becoming the advocate of a virgin, might cancel a virgin's disobedience by a virgin's obedience. So essentially, you have a kind of dichotomy here between Adam who sinned, Christ who saves, Eve who sins, Mary who brings Jesus into the world. That leads on to a whole load of kind of theological questions to do with Mary's status, and that can make some people feel a bit uncomfortable. But within Irenaeus' thinking, Mary plays a unique role because she brings Jesus into the world, and he would certainly say that Mary is a powerful figure, that Jesus is the only saviour of the world, but Mary plays a unique role within that story. And so, as we look at this, if we can kind of say that what Jesus does by coming into the world is to kind of split time in two, so that the life of Jesus is the epicenter of human history, of the world itself, then we can say that actually we find ourselves in what Hans Conselmann describes as the time of the church. Okay, we're living in the time when the work of God is to put right that which went wrong. And therefore, I think there's a strong argument to say that we see that being played out in the characters in Luke Acts. We see it in Mary. We see it, for example, also I think in Matthias, who takes over from Judas, takes the place of Judas, the exact wording is. And therefore, the thing about Acts, there's so much that we could say about how Acts ends and the fact that it ends quite ambiguously, but it does lead us to wonder, what is our part then to play in this? If the story of salvation is a story that is continuing to go out and out and out, as people are propelled by the power of God to do what they can to play their part in the story of salvation, and each person's part will be unique. Mary's part is unique, and so is Matthias, and so is Paul's, and so is everybody else. So is Stephen in Acts, for example. Then how do we ourselves find our place within that story? I won't say any more, because that is actually taking us up to the time for a break. But I think the question that we would do well to ponder is, how do we find ourselves as the inheritors of this story? And how do we continue to live this story in our little parts of the world, in our communities, and in this particular time? And I think what we might do, if you hold those questions in your mind, when we come back from our break, which we've well deserved, we'll have a little kind of breakout group time to just think about those before we go on to look at some arts, and then think about some creative responses to Luke. So is that okay?
Thank you so much, Lucy. So if we can be back at 12 noon, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at some pieces of art, because like I said in the last session, it's easy, especially for those of us who have successfully completed our education, who've learned how to read and write, and who feel quite confident reading books, to kind of take quite a bookish view of the gospel. And actually, it's not surprising, given that the Bible is in fact a book of books. It's very easy for us to take a very kind of wordy, bookish approach to things. But as in the first century, it's increasingly said that people on the whole are pretty visual these days, and that people's experiences and understanding of information will be far more readily, immediately processed visually than it will be verbally. Okay, and therefore, and it's probably always been true, if we think about the status, for example, of stained glass in medieval churches, exactly the same kind of dynamic is going on there. In the Middle Ages, many people were illiterate, many clergy were illiterate, but people could read a stained glass window in a way that they couldn't read a book, and they could therefore understand the story of salvation and start to think of their own place within it. So I'm going to share with you some pictures, and then I'm going to share with you a couple of poems as well, because I love poetry, and so do some other people. So you might find people in your church who love poems. This is from the Lindisfarne Gospels, this first picture here. And what I'm going to do is just give us a little bit of time to look at pictures and see what we make of them, basically, see what questions these pictures raise in our minds, what they might stir within our imaginations, and what we might do with them. So, as I say, this first picture comes from the Lindisfarne Gospel. So just take a moment to have a look at it. That simply says St. Luke. And this part of the session, it would be great if this could be quite interactive. So please, if you're happy to, do feel free to unmute your microphone and comment. If you want to ask any questions, feel free to. I'm not an art historian, but I'll do my best. So have a good look. What strikes you as important or interesting here?
I like the idea of how the creature above his head is like delivering the words to Luke to write down. Well, at least that's what it says, seems to say to me.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you. That's a lovely insight. Thank you. He has a cushion and a footstool. Yes, yes, he does. He's quite comfortable, isn't he? Thank you. What do we think the creature is, by the way?
An ox.
Yeah, and how do we relate that to what we know?
Oxen were sacrificed.
Yeah, I mean, at a more basic level, we know that the ox is the symbol of Luke, isn't it? And has been since early times. You find the creature rather unsettling. Yeah. Yes. Maybe that's the way that its head is turned. Yeah. I think, Sarah, that the words are imago, and then I think Dei, the image of God, but I'm not sure. Does it have a halo? Yes, it does. Both Luke and the ox have halos, and that, of course, signifies the saintliness of both Luke and of his emblem.
The creature is looking straight at us.
Yeah.
Challenging us.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great insight.
And there's something in Revelation about the winged creatures. And that's linking with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Andrea. They're both contained in a frame. Yes, that's worth noting, isn't it, really? And of course, it's that kind of beautiful Celtic loopy frame there. And of course, all stories are frames, aren't they? We kind of said that earlier on. Yeah. Let's look at another. You may have seen some of these pictures before. Some of them are more famous than others. This one is very famous, and it stands in a very strong tradition. So again, just have a little look at this. Dutch master from the 15th century. So again, just feel free to notice anything that you think might be significant or interesting.
sort of suggests to me that he's quite a cultured person.
Yes.
And the attention to Mary.
Absolutely. Look at those eyes fixed on the face of Mary. There's real attention there, isn't there?
I would say in respect to the last comment that most men look above and beyond if a woman's breastfeeding.
Yes. Yeah, and actually there is something there. Let's kind of notice that this is Mary, quite a young Mary, feeding the infant Jesus. We might be slightly weirded out by that kind of, and actually, as Paul says, the intimacy that we see in this picture, and Luke is not scared of it, is he? And yes, Wendy notes that he's looking above and beyond her. So yes, thank you. What about these two people here in the middle? What do you make of them? Because obviously we can locate Luke and we can locate Mary and Jesus, but we don't know who these are. They're turned away from us. How might we make any kind of theological sense of why there are two Dutch people here in the middle of this painting?
Well, in our group discussion just now, we talked a lot about us being part of the story. And I think the fact that it's set the painting, like so many paintings, is set in the the time and the place of the artist. Reminds us that the artist was setting it in his own town and place and time, and so it is for us. These events are for us for now. Absolutely.
And of course there's a great kind of tradition of resituating the stories of Jesus in the contemporary landscape, in contemporary clothes, and so on. And some purists might say, well, that's cultural appropriation, and some people might say, no, absolutely, that translation of the gospel into the world as it is now is the ongoing work of the people of God. And thank you, Sarah, for what you've noticed about baby Jesus's hands. It's pretty intentional there, the way that his fingers are not just resting gently in his lap. There's a blessing there from the baby Jesus, isn't there? And it does look a little bit like a startle reflex, doesn't it? Which does kind of lead to that question, was Van der Weyden actually using a real model? That's
a couple in the background make me think of either Mary's parents or Zachariah and Elizabeth.
Could be. And of course, the great thing about art is that sometimes the artist might kind of write some explanatory notes, but more often not. So what we see in a painting is kind of beautifully open to interpretation. And thank you, Kenneth, for that lovely comment there. It's refracted divinity, like the composition of the gospel. Luke is looking to Mary, who was looking to Jesus, who was looking up to God. That's absolutely wonderful. And Sarah's noting her hair is down, loose and uncovered. There is this, intimacy at homeness here, isn't there, in what is a very beautiful space. And it's beautifully symmetrical, isn't it? It's just worth noting that. Okay, in the same kind of tradition, but much more modern, 3 years ago, we have this painting by the American Stephen Wattley. So have a good look at that. And again, do feel free to share any observations, thoughts.
Looks to me like Luke, instead of holding a pen, is holding a paintbrush. And so his work is a work of art. It's not a work of geography or kind of there's an artistic impression in his work.
Yes. Thank you. Does anyone prefer this to the previous painting?
It certainly has a vibrancy that makes it very special, doesn't it? And it attracts immediately to anyone who looks at it.
Yeah, the use of colour and light in this, I think, is exceptional.
There's a lovely intimacy between Mary and Jesus, and their cheeks up to each other that's missing in the previous one.
I mean, I think they're both amazing, but yes, yeah.
In this one, they've all got halos, and the last one actually they didn't.
That's true. That's true.
And it would be really fascinating to show that last painting to people who didn't know the Christian story very well.
Yeah.
Would they have figured out what is going on? Because what came to my mind with the last one was a sense that actually Luke was dictating from Mary. She just looked like a busy woman that was so busy. Someone had to dictate her stuff, you know, because she's there looking after the baby.
So it's worth kind of noting that, doesn't it? When we look at art, this is not about kind of cracking the code. That's far too crude and simplistic, kind of an approach to take to art. But we might need to know a few things in order to make sense of these pictures, and maybe people with less biblical knowledge might struggle a bit. It's worth saying that Stephen Wattley is a Roman Catholic, and actually, even though his work is very, very contemporary, it's also deeply, deeply traditional, and therefore, yes, he gives both Mary and Luke halos, whereas that's not the case with the Van der Weyden.
What's interesting, there's a cross on the writing, and of course, at this point, Jesus still a baby.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, the cross is in the writing, kind of clearly signifying the Bible, but does that also signify Jesus' death? Yeah. Thank you. Let's look on. Got a couple more to look at. And again, this one is also featuring Mary, and again going back in time again. This is a German altarpiece from the 15th century, rich with meaning. So just take a moment to have a look. And again, please feel free to note anything, ask anything, ponder anything aloud that strikes you as interesting or important.
I love the fact that Mary's quite powerful in this painting.
Yeah. She is telling Luke what to write, isn't she? So yes, in this picture, Luke is doing what he's told, and of course,
and he looks rather grumpy about it.
Yeah. Maybe he's concentrating. Maybe he's grumpy. Yes, there's a rosary on the dresser. Only the ox has a halo. So the symbol of Luke is the thing that is kind of consecrated, as it were, Luke himself. So there's a kind of historic Luke, as it were, even though it's situated in a 15th century costume. And then there is the kind of the Luke of the imagination, if you like. What is Jesus holding? What does anyone think he might be holding?
I thought it was an apple, symbolic of second Adam.
Yeah. I mean, it's really small in this picture. It's quite difficult to see, but I think that, yes, it could well be an apple. If we think of Jesus, the second Adam, then yes, for Jesus to be holding an apple makes total sense, doesn't it? And yeah, it does look a little bit like a confessional, doesn't it? Thank you, and thank you, Paul, that you noticed that. Yeah, the rosary. So there's something there of the life of prayer, isn't there? And again, what do you notice in what Luke is holding himself? Yes, Luke is being guided by Mary and the Holy Spirit. Where do we get the Holy Spirit from? This might be an obvious question.
Is that a dove sort of right next to him, or it almost looks like a fancy tie? But I think
yes. A dove again with a halo. So something, an emblem there of the Holy Spirit. And yes, it does look very much that they are medical bottles on the dresser. Thank you. There's a lot in there, isn't there?
The baby in this painting and the first painting are both sort of turning away from Mary, whereas in the second one, the baby was cuddling up to her.
Yes, yeah. And if we wanted to ponder that theologically, we could think about the kind of the receding of Mary from the gospel narrative after the infancy story. She's not focused on very much at all, actually, in the rest of the Gospel of Luke. It's interesting to ponder why that might be. Thank you. Okay, here's a totally different one. This is a French painting from the 19th century, and this is a depiction of Luke. And again, just take a moment. What do we make of this?
He looks very prayerful and thoughtful.
He does, doesn't he? Very thoughtful, very prayerful. Thank you. Any questions that arise in your minds? So Middle Eastern, Arabic. Yeah, that does look like a Jewish prayer shawl, very much like a Jewish prayer shawl. Therefore, what question might this painting give rise to? Or what kind of what might this be suggesting about something about?
He was Jewish.
I think it's quite difficult to avoid that implication, really. Yeah. And of course, we've pondered that question already this morning, haven't we? Thinking about whether Luke was a Jew, whether he was a God-fearer, whether he was a convert of Paul. This painting is a theological interpretation. Okay, here's one which's got lots of detail in it. This is one. Yeah, thank you, Wendy. He does look very cerebral, doesn't he? This is so much. So it's, that there is so much detail in this. This is a depiction of Elizabeth here, and here we have Zachariah, and this is the angel here. Zachariah's got his thurible there. He is, of course, a priest, and some of the writing that, in fact, this says in kind of Hebrew-looking script there, Elizabeth. And I don't know if you can see these three lines here with the green, the blue, and the red, but that just says Amen, 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 over and over again. And here in this very, very fancy Latinate-looking, in fact, Latin script, do not be afraid, your prayer has been heard, with loads of beautiful kind of Celtic-y looking borders around the edges. This is by an American Japanese artist by the name of Daniel Mitsu, who is amazing. And he is, I think it's 2016, put it on the, so taken up with the art that I didn't realize I put the date on the screen. So what do we make of this? By the way, if you're interested, he's producing colouring pages of his work, because obviously there is so much detail in this, and there is so much that could be kind of coloured in over a long period of time, maybe when you're listening to a sermon or something, and that he's made many pictures of various Bible characters and also of other saints. Yeah, she really does look old, doesn't she? So one of the contrasts that we get in the infancy narratives, the kind of the old woman Elizabeth and then the young woman Mary, and that's really brought out in his pictures. Yeah, huge mix of cultural imagery, and he's particularly brilliant at this, I must say. He really sort of draws on medieval, particularly Celtic patterns, but also amazing kind of images from Chinese and Japanese imagery as well. You have to really look, don't you, to see the wood for the trees, and some people love this kind of art and other people find it a bit much. So yeah, yeah, the symbolism of the branch and the rose. Thank you, Kirsty. Yes, that's in there, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. And I think this might be one of the last ones. So this one is another recent painting. Sorry that it's not a better reproduction. This is by Laura McGowan, The Visitation. And again, just take a moment to notice anything that strikes you there. Such joy. Yeah, the facial expressions are just beautiful, aren't they?
The sense of the journey.
Yeah.
Mary's still got her cloak on, donkeys outside, you can see the road. There's a feeling of movement.
Yeah, yeah. The wee donkey, yeah. Yeah. Yes, that road stretching out before them.
I love this one and the pure joy that's on their faces, but it's a shame for such a recent painting that it's very whitewashed.
That is true. That is true.
I mean, and I found that with one of the other ones as well. For such a modern painting, you would have thought that they would actually try and make it a bit more sort of real.
Yeah, that is true. Thank you for noticing that, Sarah. Yeah, joy, yet in a very simple setting. Yeah. Whoops. Here's another one. So I think it's this one. There we are. Now I think we've only got a couple more to look at. Now these ones, yes, are whitewashed, but from a very particular perspective. I'd really encourage you to have a look at this project called Painting Luke's Gospel, which has come from a church in Glasgow. And the artist has, in fact, produced loads of resources to go with the paintings. I think he's made 12 paintings from different episodes in the Gospel of Luke. And this is one that's based on Luke's Sermon on the Plain, which has lots of overlap, as you know, with the Sermon on the Mount. Like I say, this is from a contemporary artist in Glasgow. And if you look at all of the pictures, he depicts people who he knows from Glasgow. So it's very, very consciously using the contemporary people around him to illustrate the gospel. And so this one is called Do Not Worry. And again, it's quite different, isn't it, from the others? But again, just have a moment. Any thoughts or responses to this? Does anyone like this painting?
Yes, I do. There's a sense of that contrast of fear and peacefulness. There's something about her face that portrays a search for peace that maybe she's nearly found.
It really speaks to me because I've been going through much the same thing. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Patricia. And thank you, Charles. Yes, she does look serene despite the circumstance. So we have the hospital paraphernalia all around her, and in the middle of it, there is this peace. Yeah. Thank you, Wendy. I wondered whether that's a star or a cross.
Looks like there's a dove hidden in the plastic curtain design. Don't know whether that's deliberate.
Thank you. Yeah. It's a doctor's view of a patient. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Something about the inner world and the color. Yeah. The color is all on her, isn't it? It's not on. The setting around her is deliberately kind of whitewashed out, and she is the most real thing in the picture, isn't she? There's kind of unreality to everything else, and yet her face is very, very carefully drawn. And thank you, Atlee, for noticing the dove and the leaves in the hospital curtains. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to skip over the next one because, and I'll skip over that too. So we're just coming to an end, really. So I'd like you just really to take away these questions. Depending on your church, on the technology you've got available to you, it's worth thinking about how you might use art, both in preaching and in other contexts too. Things like home groups, Lent courses, in your work with children, getting children and teenagers to look at pictures and seeing what they make of them. I found that even in churches which don't even have running water, it's still possible to print out a picture and photocopy it and give it to people in their pew sheets. And it's best to do that really, unless you've got a big enough budget to kind of do a relatively good job of producing something in colour, then probably it's best to stick with something black and white in my experience. But getting people to look at a picture can help people to see things that they wouldn't have seen otherwise, and to allow themselves to respond differently too. We respond differently to art than how we respond to what we perceive to be information, even though there is a lot of information in art. We're just going to finish with a couple of poems. Before I was ordained, I used to teach English literature, and I have always had a love of poetry, and so do many other people too, so it's not just me. And so I'm going to finish by sharing with you 3 poems that are based on St. Luke, which you may again like to think about how you might use these. And I must admit, in churches, I had one person who said to me once, I never liked poetry at school. I hated poetry. Don't do poetry. And I said, well, that's fine. And in a Lent course, he kind of came up to me and he was very grumbly and he said, you make me like poetry. And I said, well, there we are. So even people who might think they don't like poetry might find that actually if you open up a poem in a lovely way, then actually it might not be that bad after all. People can have some unfortunate experiences of having to analyse poems at school. But there we are. This is by Malcolm Guite. And as you probably know, Malcolm Guite does a wonderful job of writing poems for the church year, for other kind of special occasions. And he specialises in sonnets, which are these little 14-line poems, which are written, if you're interested, in blank verse, which is also known as iambic pentameter, which is the same way in which a lot of Shakespearean poetry is written. So there we are. That's a little moment of learning about sonnets. Here it is. His gospel is itself a living creature, a grounds and glory round the throne of God, where earth and heaven breathe through human nature, and one upon the throne sees it is good. Luke is the living pillar of our healing, a lowly ox, the servant of the four. We turn his page to find his face revealing the wonder and the welcome of the poor. He breathes good news on all who bear a burden, good news to all who try and turn again. The meek rejoice and prodigals find pardon. A lost thief reaches paradise through pain. The voiceless find their voice in every word, and with Our Lady magnify our Lord. This is another sonnet. This is from Rossetti, St. Luke the Painter. So this is picking up the same tradition that we've looked at in our art. Give honour unto Luke Evangelist, for he it was, the aged legends say, who first taught art to fold her hands and pray. Scarcely at once she dared to rend the mist of devious symbols, but soon, having wist how sky breadths and filled silence in this day are symbols also in some deeper way, she looked through these to God and was God's priest. And if past noon her toil began to irk, and she sought talismans and turned in vain to soulless self-reflections of man's skill, yet now in this the twilight she might still kneel in the latter grass to pray again, ere the night cometh and she may not work. Something there about the sanctifying influence of the gospel on art itself. This is quite a long one. I've put the whole poem on the screen, and you might love it or you might hate it. It's by D.H. Lawrence, called St. Luke. This is a very, very distinct interpretation of Luke. Very different form of poetry. A wall, a bastion, a living forehead with its slow wall of hair, and a bull's large, sombre, glancing eye and glistening adhesive muzzle, with cavernous nostrils where the winds run hot, snorting defiance or greedily snuffling behind the cows. Horns, the golden horns of power, power to kill, power to create, such as Moses had, and God, head power. Shall great wings flame from his shoulder sockets Assyrian-wise? It would be no wonder. Knowing the thunder of his heart, the massive thunder of his dew-lapped chest, deep and reverberating, it would be no wonder if great wings like flame fanned out from the furnace cracks of his shoulder sockets. Thud, 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 and the roar of Black Bull's blood in the mighty passages of his chest. Ah, the dewlap swings pendulous with excess, the great roaring weight above like a furnace dripping a molten drip. The urge, the massive burning ache of the bull's breast, the open furnace doors of his nostrils. For what does he ache and groan? In his breast a wall? Nay, once it was also a fortress wall and the weight of a vast battery. But now it is a burning hearthstone only, massive old altar of his own burnt offering. It was always an altar of burnt offering, his own black blood poured out like a sheet of flame over his fecundated herd as he gave himself forth. But it was also a fiery fortress frowning shaggily on the world and announcing battle ready. Since the Lamb bewitched him with that red stuck flag, his fortress is dismantled, his fires of wrath are banked down, his horns turn away from the enemy. He serves the Son of Man. And hear him bellow after many years, the bull that serves the Son of Man, moaning, booing, roaring, hollow, constrained to pour forth all his fire down the narrow sluice of procreation through such narrow loins, too narrow. Is he not overcharged by the dammed up pressure of his own massive black blood? Luke, the bull, the father of substance, the providence bull after 2,000 years, is he not overfull of offering, a vast, vast offer of himself which must be poured through so small a vent? Too small a vent. Let him remember his horns then, seal up his forehead once more to a bastion, let it know nothing. Let him charge like a mighty catapult on the Red Cross flag. Let him roar out challenge on the world and throwing himself upon it, throw off the madness of his blood. Let it be war. And so it is war. The bull of the proletariat has got his heads down. You might love that, or you might hate it. And on that note, we come to an end. I hope that this has given you some things to use. I hope it's given you some things to ponder. And I hope it has given you some things to learn and some things hopefully to inspire you as well as you go into this year. I would really encourage you to think about how you can not only preach particular texts on given Sundays, but how through this year we can live this gospel, live the Jesus we find in this gospel, so that we can take up our place in this story and encourage others to find their part in it too. So that's my hope, and I hope that we can find ways of encouraging each other to do that as well. So thank you for having me, really enjoyed it. And like I say, the slides will be available if you're interested, and so will the recording. So yeah.
Thank you.